I'm first going to introduce myself. I'm Tom Ward. I'm the current convener for the Rochester Committee on Latin America, and I want to say hello and welcome to all of you joining us tonight. And along that way, that's a little segue into the fact that we are starting our membership drive now. So pretty soon there'll be emails and letters in the mail flooding you with requests to renew your membership or join us if you haven't already. We'd love to have you. And we're going to be going into our 50th year next year. So we're kind of planning a big to-do in June 23rd at Genesee Valley Park. We're going to be honoring Dan Kowalczyk for his work in Nicaragua and elsewhere in Central America. And we're hoping to just have a great time. I've got the Trinidad Steel Tobago Band, steel drum band playing. And so we've got some nice festive Caribbean music going. So there'll be lots more information on that as it develops, but save the date, June 23rd. I also wanted to let you know the Nicaragua Advocacy Network has asked for support in signing a petition to support Nicaragua's sovereignty and to recognize the administration's achievements there against all of the bad publicity that corporate media is giving them. And so I'd urge you to go to their site to see the sign-in letter. We've done it as a group, as ROCLA, as an organization, but it's all lowercase letters. It's Nicaragua _ advocacy _ network _ sign -on _ letter. So I encourage you to go there and check that out, nicaraguaadvocacy.org.
Tom, you might want to put that in the chat.
I'll try to, if my typing
Yeah, so that
works.
people can get that address.
If my typing works, I'll do that. Karen, Kathy, do you want to say a few words about the Metro Justice's book sale?
Right. I just got notice that the Metro Justice is sponsoring a winter book fair this coming Saturday, December the 10th. That's for local people here from 2 to 9. And this is going to be at the 389 Gregory Street, the Genesee Co-op Credit Union. And it's going to be on the 3rd floor from 2 to 9, as I say. There's going to be books and book readings as children, some goodies to be sold. But if you have a moment, you might want to stop by on the 3rd floor.
Yeah, I understand our friend Henry Padron will be there doing stories.
He's going to be reading books to children.
Yeah, and some
That's
Brazilian
his forte.
music.
So
The Brazilian some music from Brazil. Sounds like an exciting day.
right. So if you have a moment, you might want to stop by.
Great, thank you. Does anybody else have any announcements? John, anything from Metro Justice that you want to add? Or Terry, do you want to tell us again about some of the upcoming events that you got going in Buffalo? Okay. Oh, Terry, you're muted.
Yeah, so in Buffalo, the Latin America Solidarity Committee and the Western New York Peace Center, we try to have an event the 4th Monday of every month. So you could watch for us. We have something planned for January, February, and March.
Okay. All right. Then without further ado, let me introduce Karen to you. She's been with us before, but because of the recent elections that took place there and other developments, we thought it would be a great timing to bring Karen back to just give us an update on what's going on. And I can tell you that Karen was actually boots on the ground in Honduras when that coup happened. And she was there all during the time that the peaceful protests were trying to take place, and they were met with violence and even death. Lasted for several months. But Karen was a witness to that, and she became a humanitarian activist there and researcher, and she's currently the Honduras-based coordinator for the Honduras Solidarity Network. And she also hosts the Honduras Now podcast. If you could go on and listen, it's at hondurasnow.org. And she hosts a blog at aquiabajo.com, AQUIABAJO.com. Karen's husband is Edwin Espinal, and he and others had been put in a terrible military prison for their work in environmental defense, and suffered quite a bit there. And fortunately, he's out right now and awaiting the final disposition of his sentence. So we wish him well, Karen. Take our greetings back to him, and big hugs from all of us. So Karen's presentation tonight is going to focus primarily on how the U.S. efforts are attempting to stop many of the reforms that the new president, democratically elected president, I might add, Xiomara, is trying to implement with her administration. They have gotten some through, some good positive policies as well, and Karen will talk about those. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Karen Spring. Thank you, Karen.
Thanks so much, Tom, for the introduction, and good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me. I don't remember when I was with ROCLA last. I think it was maybe the beginning of the year.
Yeah, it's been probably a year.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Time flies. Wow. Okay. So thanks for the introduction, Tom. And so my name's Karen, and I'm calling you or talking to you sitting in a house in Toronto, Canada, and I'm headed to Honduras tomorrow. So I have an early flight, like Tom mentioned, but I'm looking forward to escaping the freezing cold and getting back to the heat. And everything that's going on in Honduras. And like Tom mentioned, I've been living and working in Honduras since the coup. So I always lose track, 13, 14 years. The coup was in 2009. So it's, I thought I was going to only stay in Honduras for a couple of months, and then ended up staying there for 13 or 14 years. But I mean, you kind of all know that because I've talked to you before. And so thanks again to ROCLA for organizing tonight and for doing a great job promoting the event. It's actually nice when the group is smaller because we can get more out of the discussion and into questions and everything. So I think I probably won't talk for too long, hopefully, and then we'll have some more time. We'll have some time for questions at the end. But basically, I think probably, one of the things that I want to kind of start is just talking a little bit about like the victory of the new president well, she's not really that new anymore. She's almost been in office now for a year. Xiomara Castro is the president of Honduras. She's the first woman president of Honduras, which is very, very exciting for women in Honduras and just Hondurans in general. She basically ran over almost a year ago today. She won the elections, and in quite a landslide victory for her and the platform that she put forward in her campaign. And when, people were very, very hopeful and are still hopeful that her government will be able to overcome the challenges that it faces so that they can push through some of the reforms and some of the policies that she ran on. So she took office in January of 2020. So it's almost been a year. It'll be a year next January. And she had a whole, just so many campaign promises. And I'm just going to highlight a couple because they're very inspiring. And I think that it's always important for any progressive government that comes to power to have a very inspiring agenda and aspirations and goals. And I think that's something that she had, and the party had, and lots of people in her government. So some of the things that she promised to do, which there's a whole slew of things that she promised to do, but I'm going to focus on the ones that are more relevant to sort of like global issues and just US policy, and then human rights as well, since I work mostly in human rights, and so does the Honduras Solidarity Network. So basically some of the things that she did, I'm just going to list off a couple of things. So she promised to establish stronger ties with China, which of course is not something that the US is very happy about or would be very happy about. She promised to legislate and implement policies regarding the morning, the morning after pill for women. with certain conditions, but this was something that was actually legal before the coup in 2009. And Xiomara said that she wanted to bring that back for women, and it was actually outlawed after the coup. She wanted to send the military back to their barracks and get them off the streets, which is obviously something that is really exciting and important to do, because, you know, the military shouldn't be on the streets, shouldn't have policing functions. She actually committed to reviewing CAFTA and the free trade agreement, which is something that, you know, Honduras has never really benefited from. It's been much more to the benefit of US companies and yeah, the United States mostly. She also said that she was going to reform the energy law. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. It's hard to understand, but I'll talk about what that means and what are the challenges with doing that. She said she'd overturn the ZEDE law. The ZEDEs are the zones of economic development and employment, which are these really, really crazy idea. And I'm not sure if anyone here has heard about the ZEDEs, but the ZEDEs are like model cities. They're basically private cities, charter cities. They have a bunch of different names, but they're very, very widely promoted and pushed by libertarians, a lot of libertarians based out of the US. And it basically means what it's meant, at least in the legislation that was passed after the coup, is that they you carve off a chunk of Honduran territory and hand it over to the highest bidder. And they can create their own court system, their own policing system, their own social security, their own system, their own courts, their own police, their own like national anthem, like everything. They're basically their own nation within the borders of Honduras. And so she promised to overturn that legislation that was pushed forward by the post-coup government. And she also wanted to establish the Commission Against Impunity and Corruption in Honduras, which is modeled off of the Guatemala CICIG, which is no longer exists, unfortunately. But basically an internationally funded body that sort of investigates corruption and impunity in the country. So when she, you know, put forward this platform along with her party and everybody that sort of ran under her and the Libre Party, which is the party she is part of, people were really hopeful. I mean, these are very, very, I think people spent years after the coup, 12 years under a narco dictatorship. A lot of you and ROCLA certainly followed, and some people on this call as well, really, really followed what was going on in the country and all of the abuses that took place, the rise of like a very corrupt state that was run by drug traffickers. Juan Orlando Hernandez, the former president, who just like stepped out of, he left office the day that Xiomara obviously took power. And then the day he left office, the US Justice Department signed a request for his extradition to face drug trafficking charges in the US. So he is now in prison in the US, awaiting trial for drug trafficking charges and related weapons charges. So you know, if you have a president that literally the day that he steps out of office, an 8-term presidency, and then he's asked for extradition by the United States, who supported and backed him through the 8 years he was in power, you can only imagine the crimes that he committed while he was in power. And I think drug trafficking is probably the less of his crimes, even though obviously it's devastating for the country and for people that, you know, are, you know, involved in the drug trade, but also consume drugs in an abusive way across the Americas. But you can imagine, you know, all the measures that he went to maintain his power, which wasn't just about his political power, but was about his economic power and controlling the drug cartels in the country for his own economic benefit. So you can imagine what Hondurans like suffered if the president alone and what he was involved in doesn't speak about or doesn't give an indication of what Hondurans were dealing with and what they were so tired of. Then you can only imagine, then, I mean, you know that they were facing also like massive human rights violations. Honduras became the most dangerous country in the Western or in the world at the peak of his dictatorship. Right after the coup, it became one of the most dangerous countries to be an environmentalist, a journalist, a land defender, and so many people lost their lives under his regime. So Xiomara's platform is very inspiring. And so she was widely voted for and widely supported by the Honduran population. So, you know, she's taken power since. So January 27th, I think, of this year, 2020, she took power. And she's just faced, like, her government has faced endless challenges. And obviously it's not easy taking over a government that's been controlled by a drug cartel for so long. And the challenges are just, I'm going to name a couple, the ones that I think are the most important. She basically took over a government and a state that is totally broke. I mean, all of the money that the previous governments following the coup, you know, that the US and Canada supported, kept funding, kept sending more money to, you know, there's just endless corruption that took place in that government, and overspending as well, especially on the military and policing that obviously had no effect for what it was intended to do, which was allegedly to make Honduras a safer place for its citizens. Instead, money was spent on, you know, basically promoting a military and police that were also trafficking drugs along with the president, while they were also squashing any protests or any opposition to the government and its policies. So I think the amount of debt that Xiomara has to deal with, she inherited a state that is totally broke. There's no money. And I think that it's estimated, and this isn't a very good measurement, but I'm not really sure how else to explain it. But Honduras, in their external and internal debt, it totals 56.7% of their GDP, or $15.68 billion is what Honduras owes, which I know is hard to conceptualize. But I mean, I'm sure the United States owes more than that and has more debt than that, much more. But the thing is that Honduras has a very little income. They don't have very strong tax collection, so it's very difficult. They're also paying like crazy interest rates on these loans. So that's a huge problem for Xiomara in implementing the reforms that she outlined in her platform. She also inherited a state that's totally infiltrated by organized crime. I mean, consistently, and still today, we hear all about, you know, mayors and police officers, groups of police officers, military that are involved in drug trafficking and still involved in drug trafficking. And so she is responsible. She is the head of the armed forces, and the Minister of Security, who runs the police, is also under her command. But she really has no control over a lot of these rogue, you know, groups and organized criminal groups that are operating inside the police and military still. So it's been a huge problem across the board in the country for security and also for repression against different populations, especially like land defenders, for example, which continues to be a problem under Xiomara's government because she, again, doesn't have full control of the military and police. She also has a very weak government. She doesn't control all branches of government. She is head of the executive branch, but even with her being a head of the executive branch, you know, she still has parts that are offices or institutions that are under her command that she doesn't have full control under or over. She doesn't control Congress, or the Libre Party, which is her party, doesn't have full control over Congress. So they're constantly negotiating and trying to figure out how to pass bills that are part of her platform, but, you know, is constantly facing, and the United States plays a huge role in undermining what the Congress is trying to do when the Libre Party is able to put forward something that sort of promotes Xiomara's platform. And there are constant divisions, and these are obviously sort of provoked as well by the US, which I'll get into a little bit more. And she also doesn't control the judiciary, which is huge, and the Attorney General's office, which are the two bodies that basically decide what will be investigated and when, and who goes to prison and who doesn't. So that's very important for criminalizing protests and criminalizing land offenders. Xiomara has no power over that. Those are still under the control of people that were appointed by the narco dictatorship and by Juan Orlando Hernandez, and people that are still loyal to him despite the fact that he's in prison. They put the head of the cartel in prison, but all of the arms and legs and the tentacles of the narco dictatorship are still very much alive. And so that is definitely the case with the judiciary and the Attorney General's office. And despite the fact that she's sort of like chief of the armed forces, you know, the armed forces have not changed at all, and they haven't been cleaned up, and they're the same armed forces that, you know, supported the coup and that were involved in drug trafficking and sort of promoted and kept Juan Orlando Hernández in power despite his whole range of abuses. So, I mean, you have this great platform. She gets to power and she's faced with all of these challenges that are constantly undermining any sort of ability for her to really push through, her and her government to push through any significant changes and to promote her platform. I mean, and despite that, there are some things that they've done that, and the government has done that are very inspirational and that they have been able to achieve. And I'm going to mention those. And I think I'm gonna pick a couple because there are certain things that Xiomara's government has been able to implement that are very, very incredible, but that the US is constantly undermining because they don't like these policies. So, I mean, I'm sure a lot of you remember when I think in 2017 and even back to 2014, there was this whole, the US media, mainstream media was really focused on all these unaccompanied minors that were coming from Honduras and Central America and that were making their way to the border. And then they put together the Biden plan and to sort of deal with the unaccompanied minors at the border to address migration. And like that didn't work. And then so now with the migration, following all the migration at the US and Mexico border, Vice President Kamala Harris has put together this call to action that she launched in May of last year, basically saying that they're going to address the root causes of migration. And so I think they've designated like billions of dollars to this call to action for the Northern Triangle countries, which the Northern Triangle countries are El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And they're going to stop, you know, migration or address these so-called root causes of migration. And Kamala Harris is under the impression that companies like Gap and Visa and Microsoft and Nespresso are some of the great companies that are going to help deal with these root causes of migration. So I mentioned that because, you know, that there's a whole big chunk of money that's being promised to the Northern Triangle countries. And I would argue that the US is sort of using that amongst other things to sort of extort the Xiomara government into doing things or not doing things that are against the interests, because you have this Honduran government that is totally broke because of a narco dictatorship, that it like stole all the money, that misspent a lot of the money that the US supported and backed for so long, in this condition where they have no money and they really want to, you know, address and make changes that the Honduran people really badly need. And then you have the US saying, well, we have all this money, but then they're kind of dangling in their faces saying, you know, we'll give it to you, but you have to do certain things or you're not allowed to do certain things. And I'm going to go through some of the things that they haven't liked so far. And they've been very vocal about it. And it's very problematic and it's very worrisome because, you know, people are under the impression in the US that, you know, the narco dictatorship's out of power now. Honduras is great. Honduras has a democratic socialist government. It's progressive government. It cares about human rights. So we can move on to other countries now and we don't have to worry about Honduras. But it's actually a really, really important time to keep watching Honduras because of how all the challenges that the government is facing and just the historical presence of the United States in Honduras has always undermined anything progressive or anything that sort of challenges US economic interests in Honduras, but not just Honduras, in the region. Because Honduras has been sort of the country where the US has sort of launched a lot of its wars in the past. It's the home to the largest US military base in the region. And so the US is not going to let any government do whatever they want in Honduras. You know, they don't really do that anywhere, but they're specifically not going to allow it in Honduras. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what they have opposed and what Xiomara has been able to do and just how much backlash she's getting from the US over it. So what's going on is the US, when Xiomara won, interestingly enough, congressional offices in the US were telling us that, you know, the State Department was sort of going around to congressional offices and saying, you know what, we really support Xiomara. You need to support her. She's going to do great things. And so there was this, and Kamala Harris even went to her inauguration. And so there was this impression that the US was starting off well, and everyone was sort of suspicious about it because the US doesn't just go and support a progressive government that identifies as democratic socialist out of nowhere. But it was sort of like positive. It was like, okay, you know, we'll see how this goes. This is positive. obviously suspicious at the same time. But what's happening now is the US is really not liking some of the things that Xiomara promised that she would do. And I think the US kind of bet that she wouldn't be able to do it, and that they would work really hard to undermine her agenda and undermine her government. And that's exactly what they're doing. So the US is now teaming up with the opposition, which is the Narco National Party. It's basically a party that is like, just totally infiltrated by organized crime. It was Juan Orlando Hernández's party. And they're teaming up with the government sort of enemies, or people that are, either they're NGOs that the State Department has funded for many years. They're now sort of raising their voice and being very critical of Xiomara. And so the US is sort of like, I don't think they necessarily support the National Party, which was the narco party that I talked about that was in power since the coup. But they're sort of taking advantage of the fact that they're the opposition now, and they're sort of mixing their message against the government to sort of go at the Xiomara government. And so you have this really, really powerful opposition of these really, really incredible and powerful forces that are criticizing everything her government does. So I'm talking the oligarchs, the very wealthy families that have controlled Honduras for many, many years. There's like 12 to 13 families. I'm talking about the military, that obviously any Latin American country is always going to be worried about what their military says and supports, because the military has just so much tremendous power, not just in Latin America, but also in the United States. And they're also, and then I mentioned the National Party. And so, along with the US government, those are the actors. They're all sort of working together to really undermine the government. And it's very concerning, because it makes a weak government even weaker. And it doesn't really give them any breathing room either to make mistakes. And every government's going to make mistakes. So I'm going to focus on 3 key policies and promises that Xiomara made during her campaign, and the ones that she's been able to fulfill. And then I'm going to talk about what the US is doing to undermine that. So the first one I want to talk about is the temporary labor law. The temporary labor law was passed under the narco dictatorship after the coup, and it was a heyday for US companies. It was a heyday for when they passed it. It was basically eliminated any benefits or any labor laws for transnational companies. So I'm talking about textile companies. I'm Canadian, so I always think of Gildan, but if people follow Haiti at all, they know that Gildan is a very, very bad company. It's a large sweatshop company. There's a couple of, Sanmar is another one that's a US textile company. Just, all foreign companies, but, the US specifically, they really benefited from this temporary labor law, because it basically said that they could contract Honduran workers for 4 hours a day, pay them less than minimum wage, and they didn't have to pay any benefits or any pension or anything, any sick days, no vacation days, nothing. And so it was great for these companies, but it was terrible for Honduran workers. And so the Xiomara government recognized that as being something that was very damaging, because it undermines the labor movement. It undermines job security for workers. And since, jobs and unemployment are a major driver of migration, the Xiomara government said, you know what, we're going to overturn that law. And then these companies are going to have to abide by the labor law. The labor law that's been, that it sort of, the temporary labor law took over or trumped the labor law. And so they overturned it, and they're like, okay, you got to abide by the labor law now, like the regular labor law. And so, and since they did that, the US government has taken every opportunity possible, led by the ambassador, to talk about how much that temporary labor law undermines investment in Honduras. And if we're thinking about Kamala Harris's promise and call to action with all these companies like Pepsi and Microsoft and all of these big companies that are allegedly going to bring Honduras out of poverty and stop migration, none of these companies are going to invest in Honduras if they don't have like a very exploitive labor law that lets them pay Honduran workers nothing, so that they can, continue profiting off of investing there. And so the US ambassador's just been really, really vocal, and in State Department reports about how this is undermining investment in Honduras, and being very critical of it, and saying that it's damaging relations and damaging the willingness of companies to invest in Honduras. And so I'm just going to give example of the US hypocrisy as the Kamala Harris government is sort of, talking about addressing the root causes of migration, which one of them is unemployment or underemployment. people not having jobs. Young people graduate from university, they can't get a job. They drop resumes off everywhere. They spend, months and months and months dropping resumes off. They can't get a job. There's no jobs. And the jobs that they do get are terrible in terms of conditions and the exploitive nature of a lot of these companies, because the companies know that there's just so many people that want jobs. They take advantage of that desperation. And so they just fire people and hire people and fire them if they don't like it and hire someone to replace them. And so what the embassy, when they overturned the temporary labor law, the US is actually building a new embassy in Tegucigalpa, a huge, gigantic building, huge. Really ugly. I don't know who designed it, but it's not a very nice building. But anyways, they've hired Honduran workers to build this embassy. And they, when they overturned the temporary labor law, these workers started saying, okay, well, now you have to, hire us under the normal labor law. That means you have to pay minimum wage. That means you have to pay us vacations. That means you have to pay us pensions. And they wouldn't do it. And the US company that's building the new US embassy, BL Harbert, which apparently builds embassies all over the world. Basically, the workers went on strike and they just refused to sit down at the negotiating table, refused. And so the workers that went on strike, they were fired and replaced by other workers. And they still don't want to pay the benefits to these workers at all. So it's interesting because as much as the US talks about enforcing the rule of law and getting these companies to abide by the law, their own companies don't want to abide by the law and pay the benefits to workers, including the ones that are building their own embassy where they're going to conduct all of their diplomatic relations out of. Also maquila companies or sweatshop companies as well. They're laying massive layoffs in a lot of these factories because they no longer have the temporary labor law to exploit workers. And so they're laying off like hundreds of workers in these factories. And the women's organization that works with a lot of these workers is saying, what, we want these factories to be here, but we want them to give us good salaries, and we want decent working conditions, which is not a lot to ask. So the US Embassy has been very vocal against this temporary labor law, overturning the temporary labor law and having to abide by, heaven forbid, the actual labor law, which protects workers. Another thing that the US Embassy's done to really interfere in Xiomara's, another thing that Xiomara promised that she would do, that she did do through Congress, is that she promised to overturn the ZEDE law. That's the model cities, the private city law. So they overturned it in Congress, and it still is not fully overturned yet, but important steps have been made to do that. And the US Embassy, there's this one company that is a model city. It's called Zede Prospera, based in the Bay Islands, the beautiful Bay Islands of Honduras and Roatan, which is where a lot of people, if they visited Honduras, would have gone to that place. A lot of cruise ships stop there because it's a beautiful place. And so these US investors are invested in and have obtained land to build a ZEDE in Roatan. And when the Honduran government overturned the ZEDE law, these investors of this ZEDE Prospera basically threatened the government that they were going to file suit against the Honduran government under CAFTA and sue the government for taking away their ability to, for the money that they've lost in their investment and their ability to make money in the future. So right now, this company has filed a notice of arbitration under CAFTA, which means it's suing the Honduran government for lost profits. And they're saying that they've lost $10.7 billion, and that's how much they're suing the Honduran government for. And I should say that Zede Prospera is actually American owned. The companies are based in the US. I think Delaware is one. There's two or three companies. They're based in different parts of the US. And so they themselves are suing the Honduran government, but it goes it goes beyond that. The Zedes in Honduras have always been very, very unpopular. They're widespread, just like rejection of Zedes from the very beginning that they were proposed after the coup. And there's been years and years and years of protesting. In fact, I remember starting to protest the Zedes in 2012 and standing outside the courthouse every day protesting it with other Hondurans, or with Hondurans. I'm not Honduran, but with Hondurans. I forget that sometimes. And I remember doing that. And so, like 10 years later, Hondurans were still battling the Zedes. And so Xiomara takes power and says, we're getting rid of this legislation. This is ridiculous. So they overturn it. And so as this Zede Prospera is threatening to sue the Xiomara government for lost profits, you have these two US senators. One is Senator Hagerty from Tennessee and Senator Cardin from Maryland. And they wrote a public letter recently, basically criticizing the reforms that overturned the Zedes, saying that they were threatening US interests, and that they were disappointed that the government was threatening US interests. And that was very disappointing to see, especially out of Senator Cardin, because he has been very supportive in the past of actions that we've done in Honduras. And but it goes to show you just, how much the US is not willing to let Xiomara implement these important things and support what the Honduran people want and what the Honduran people have asked for so long. And I just want to mention really quickly that almost immediately before the Zede Prospera announced they were suing the Honduran government, the US Embassy tweeted that they had met with the investors of the Zede Prospera, basically throwing fuel on the fire, that they, were supporting the Zede, they were supporting the investors, and that the investors should keep going in Honduras, despite the fact that nobody wants them there. And I just want to take this really quick opportunity to say that the School of America's Watch, it's a fantastic US-based organization. They put out an action recently asking people to sign on to an action to denounce the role of the US in the Zedes and promoting the Zedes. So I will forward that to Tom, and maybe Tom can send that out if people are interested. I highly encourage people to join us in that action and promote it as much as they can. And the Honduras Solidarity Network also put out a statement about US intervention. And we touched on these other things I'm touching on. So that also can be found on our social media accounts, which I'll mention at the end of this talk. So the final sort of thing I wanted to mention is, and probably for me the most important, and definitely something that the US is really, really unhappy about, probably the most unhappy about, is this energy law that Xiomara has passed, the Xiomara government through the Congress has passed. And it's interesting, I'm going to say the name of the law, because I think it's very telling about what Xiomara was trying to do. It's very long, so I never really say it ever, but you got to take a deep breath to say it. It's called the Special Law to Guarantee Electricity as a Common Good for National Security and as an Economic and Social Human Right. That's actually what the law is called. And so basically what they wanted to do is they wanted to roll back privatization of Honduras's energy generation, transmission, and distribution, which is basically the whole energy grid, everything, totally. So energy law. So basically what the Xiomara government tried to do is, sorry, someone's writing in the chat. Yep, I'll put the name of the law in the chat after for sure. So basically, this law is trying to roll back privatization, and mostly some of the companies that have most benefited from the energy privatization are U.S. companies. So solar, wind, which people usually are very supportive of solar and wind, but the way that solar and wind energy projects in Honduras have been implemented is not, it's usually through the oligarchs, through the wealthy families, and they create a lot of land problems because you need land to have a whole bunch of different solar, put up different solar panels, and also like wind turbines. So basically what this new law is doing is that Xiomara said, okay, any Honduran families that consume less than 150 kilowatts of energy a month, they're all going to get free energy. So this has benefited 1.2 million families around Honduras, which if you ask people why they were, some of the reasons why they were leaving Honduras and fleeing to the US and US-Mexico border, they would say that energy costs were just too much. They were too high because of the privatization of the energy generation mostly. And so this has been hugely beneficial to many Honduran families. And then Xiomara also said, you know what, we can't pay these high energy costs that these private energy generation companies are charging the state to generate electricity. So she said, we're going to start renegotiating those contracts, and we're going to lower the amount of money that these companies are making and that the state is paying them to make the electricity. And so that's what they're doing, in the process of doing. And two energy companies that are not in agreement with having, not making millions of dollars off of the backs of Honduran people have now decided that they're going to also potentially sue the Honduran government under CAFTA as well for lost profits, because the government's renegotiating these contracts. And obviously some of the companies that have been the most affected are US companies that basically work in Honduras to exploit these contracts, and that a lot of them were approved based on corruption and cronies that work alongside the former narco dictatorship and its government. So I think I might leave it there. That's a lot of information. It's nice to probably, Rebecca actually, thank you, Rebecca, put in the chat the link to the SOA Watch action that I mentioned about the ZEDEs. And they also mentioned the energy law, and I think the temporary labor law in that action as well, the three policies that the US has been very vocal about. So the link to that action is in the chat. So definitely, if you can participate in that action and forward it to your networks, that would be fantastic. So I think I'll end there. I could say lots more, but I'll leave it there for questions and maybe a discussion too, if there's still time.
Okay, does anybody have any questions? Just either raise your hand on your little window, or Karen, what can you say about the Garifunas? Are some of these model cities, are they on land that's been taken from them, for example? Or I know there's been a lot of trouble in the Garifuna communities with these investors.
Yeah, so the ZEDEs, one of the things that's been challenging for the new government is to actually understand where there are ZEDEs and where the former government actually signed documents to hand over pieces of land. One of the things that Juan Orlando Hernandez's government did is they destroyed a lot of public documents before they left office. And that's also been a major challenge for the government to understand, like, what did the government actually do regarding ZEDEs? What did they sign? What commitments were made behind closed doors? And so we're not really entirely sure where all the ZEDEs are. But the ones that have moved forward and that have been vocal against the government, they're not necessarily on Garifuna land, but the same sort of dynamics that play out. The Zede Prospera actually impacts a community that has been in Roatan for centuries. It's not Garifuna, but it has Garifuna people that live in the community, as well as Miskito indigenous people. And again, it's not Garifuna land, but all the dynamics like the evictions, the threats, it remains with this Zede specifically in Zede Prospera. But I mean, the Garifuna recently were evicted from their community in Punto Gorda, really close to actually where the Zede Prospera is trying to build its Zede on the island of Roatan. And that was carried out by a corrupt judge, again, that Xiomara and the executive branch of the government doesn't have control over. But it was very disappointing to see the police and the military involved in that eviction. But again, that has a lot to do with the fact that, there are still there's a lot of corruption in the police, and Xiomara doesn't necessarily have like full-blown control of the police. So the Garifuna issue is ongoing, as is a lot of the land issues that we're seeing that we've seen in Honduras. Granted, I think the Xiomara government is very, very particular about not wanting to violently evict communities or any protesters, and they do everything possible to avoid that. And the fact that that happened with the Garifuna is, I think, more telling of the different de facto powers that are operating inside the state than it is the actual central government and its ability to control everything. I'm not sure if that answered your question, Tom.
Oh, it does. Thank you. We got a couple more questions. First, Sunny, and then Carol.
Actually, I have a couple of comments, actually a comment, a suggestion, and a question, if I can do all of them, so they all go right together.
As long as
Karen,
we're done before midnight, you go ahead.
Okay. So Karen, I really thank you for this update. It is unfortunately what too many of us have expected and feared might be coming. I live in the greater Boston area and work with Mass Peace Action's Latin America, Caribbean Working Group, and we've done a fair amount of work with SOA Watch, and particularly Brigitte and others from the Honduran team of Witness for Peace. So the comment related to that is the only thing I disagree with what you said is that in fact,
Sorry, Sunny, can I just interrupt you? If there's
Yes.
can the host kick out Randy?
Yeah, I'm trying to.
Thank you. So in any case, the one place I disagree with what you said was that the US is being hypocritical about addressing the root causes of immigration. The US is doing exactly what Kamala Harris said she saw the solution as, which was US corporations investing in the Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador area. So they're only doing what they said they were going to do. And the real question is how we stop them. So my suggestion is, I'm aware of not the most recent SOA Watch action alert that you talked about, but there was one a little bit ago related to the embassy workers' strike. And my real suggestion to the Solidarity Network is try to come up with a monthly action that all the rest of us can.
Been very supportive, sort of the standard names, I think, and maybe Rebecca can help me a bit here too with some of the names, but there's Ilhan Omar. I'm terrible with names. I always forget names. There is there is oh my gosh, I didn't even, Rebecca, do you know some of the names of the people that have been super supportive? There's some of the names are slipping my mind right now.
Harriet is putting them on there. She's always
Yeah.
on top of
Oh,
them.
Great.
Yeah, well, Jan Schakowsky,
Yeah,
who's
she's
from Illinois, and she's really consistent. And I think Chuy Garcia, who's the new person from Chicago, went. And in the past, Hank, was it Hank Johnson, I think, from Georgia. I don't know that he's been as active. And sadly, in the Senate, we'll be losing Patrick Leahy, who's been incredible for years.
And there's a couple more that have been really awesome as well. Rebecca, can you think of any more? There's some, oh my goodness, the names will come to me. I'm terrible with names.
They're like the most important, like the principal ones, and like Minnesota Omar is important because of the group that she comes from.
Oh, Cori Bush has been great too. Yeah,
Cori
Harriet basically highlighted the most important, but Cori Bush has been really great as well. And who's the new Congress representative from New York? He's not really that new anymore.
Oh, you mean
Jamal
AOC?
Jamal
Ocasio-Cortez. I don't know how active she's been on.
No,
Honduras.
she hasn't really been that active on Honduras, no. But I think we have the main ones. But I mean, if, actually it would be great, Sunny, if someone from Mass wanted to come to, the Honduras Solidarity Network has a Washington congressional working group, and we meet every week and we talk about congressional action and work on Honduras. And it's also mixed in with other Central America stuff as well. So it's not just Honduras. There are other, we also look at other bills, like right now, there's a bill that is going to be introduced as well about the Chixoy Dam in Guatemala, which is another big struggle, but and important for the rest of Latin America. So feel free to send us an email if you are interested in joining those, or someone from Mass is interested. It'd be great to have you.
Carol has a question.
Yeah, I'm sometimes part of a group that goes to a set of villages in Chibuca in the rural mountains for education, public health, and medical kind of services. And back in May, when people went down, of course, there was some change in the local government, and some Libre people wanted the group to leave and not come back again. But then after some extensive discussion, they decided to leave us alone and back off. And I kind of wondered, is there this growing resentment of foreigners? And then the other one is just a comment. Probably you don't have anything to say about it, but when we came back a month ago, and when we went through customs, the customs agents took some of who they could take from our group and went through their suitcases. And usually we take half of our stuff is medical and school supplies. And so the custom agents of those people that they were able to get their hands on took all the medical supplies, including toothbrushes, which they classified as medical supplies. So, maybe that's just the corruption. I wouldn't think that that would be a part of Xiomara's plan. And that's it.
Sure. So that doesn't sound very positive. Again, I think it's very telling of the challenges, the significant challenges that are ongoing in Honduras. So regarding the mayor in Intibuca, I would be curious to hear where exactly that was, what municipality. I think that it's important to know and to tell you that there have been some longstanding mayors that sort of knew that the National Party was sinking and jumped ship and went over to the other party, went over to the Libre Party to sort of take advantage of the political environment in the country so that they could win the election, despite the fact that they're not actually they don't actually support Libre's platform. So I would be interested to hear why the mayor was saying that, and also just who this mayor is, and that would be interesting to know. And then on the migration stuff, so actually one of the a big pressure that is not very public, but I know exists, is that the US is really, really pushing on the Honduran government to crack down on their borders and on really controlling customs and really controlling borders. And that's all related to migration. It's all related to the war on drugs, quote unquote. And so I think mostly half of all people that go through the airport, including myself, are pulled aside and their bags are searched. And I think they're doing that too, because they're also, and this is sort of my analysis of this is that I think there's been a lot of illegal smuggling in the past of things. And I think that the government's cracking down on that as well. But that's odd. You have to remember too, that a lot of the people in these institutions and the state institutions are people that were put in their position by the former government. So you have a lot of people that don't actually share the government's principles at all, but are still working in the institutions. And the government has not done mass layoffs of employees, which they tend to do when a new party takes power. But I wonder how you can resolve that issue. If you send me an email, I'll write my email in the chat. Maybe I can ask migration authorities how you can avoid that happening again. So I'll put my email address in the chat, and maybe I can help with that at some point.
Thank you.
Any other questions? If not,
Raise your
yeah.
hand.
Sylvia?
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to know if there's any information about femicide.
Femicide is such a huge issue in Honduras, and there's been no advancement on stopping femicides in Honduras. One, because it's a huge, huge structural problem that has existed for so long. And two, because I don't think there's going to be an advancement anytime soon because there might be next year, hopefully, but again, it's an uphill battle. The Attorney General's office and the court system are still in the hands of the narco dictatorship. But I also wanted to mention that, you know, the new police or the new Minister of Security and the Vice Minister of Security, who's a woman actually, they just uncovered a massive human trafficking ring in Roatan, where a lot of people go to vacation. And it's being led by Americans that are expats living in Roatan that are actually kidnapping Honduran women. And they're basically the gateway into human trafficking networks. Very concerning. It's not femicide, but it's all related. And it's very disgusting. It disgusts me every time I think about it. But there's been disappearances of girls and women, and it's growing around the country. And a lot of people think that it's about these human trafficking networks that, you know, involve foreigners that are expats living in Roatan that basically have enjoyed impunity for so long. And they're very, very challenging networks to dismantle, especially given the amount of organized crime that still operates within a lot of these government institutions. That's sort of what I have to say about femicide. It is definitely not a problem that has been addressed. And it's a very difficult problem as with the current conditions for the new government to address.
Thank you.
Sorry, I don't have more than that on.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Sunny, are you, no? Then in that case, I'm gonna let Karen get going, but I want to